Hey everyone, and welcome back. Today we're going to be tackling a topic that I know is on a lot of people's minds.
Oh, yeah. Folks who are thinking about sponsoring a family member for immigration, that whole I-130 petition process.
Exactly. And look, we're not in the business of predicting the future,
Yeah, no crystal ball here.
but we can look at, past trends. We can analyze potential policy directions based on, what's been said and done and try to get a clearer picture what the landscape might look like.
Yeah, it's all about being prepared, right?
Yeah.
Especially when it comes to something as important as, helping your family members come to the U.S.
Couldn't agree more. So for this deep dive, we're going to be unpacking a recent video analysis that does exactly that. It takes a look at the past, Trump's first term and kind of extrapolates out to what could happen in a second term if things continue along the same trajectory.
It's a fascinating analysis, really. It kind of holds up a mirror to the past and then tries to project that reflection into the future.
I love that analogy. And speaking of reflections, the video highlights 5 key areas where we might see some pretty significant shifts.
5 key areas. Ooh, that's a lot to unpack.
It is. But don't worry, we'll break it all down for you. Think of these 5 areas as our roadmap for this deep dive.
Okay, I'm ready when you are.
All right, let's jump in. So the first area the video flags is increased scrutiny around national security concerns.
National security.
Yeah. Now, we're not talking about, like major terrorist threats or anything like that.
Right.
But rather a much more rigorous vetting process for both the U.S. citizen sponsoring the petition, that's you listening out there, A and D, the family member being sponsored with a particular emphasis on criminal history.
Okay, so even more background checks than there are now.
Oh, yeah. Much more in depth. And they'll be looking at everything, even minor offenses.
I see. And is this like a totally new thing, or is it building on trends we've already seen?
Well, we definitely saw a trend in this direction during Trump's first term.
Oh, yeah, for sure, with things like the travel ban and just generally increased vetting for visa applicants.
Exactly. What's interesting here, though, is that this analysis suggests these measures could become even more widespread and even more intensive in a second term.
So more intense in what way? Like, what could this increased scrutiny look like in practice?
Well, for starters, we could see mandatory interviews becoming the norm for, pretty much all I-130 petitions. Not just, certain cases like it is now.
Okay, so everyone would have to go through an interview.
Most likely. And this is where it gets a bit more intense. The analysis even mentions the possibility of home visits by immigration officers.
Home visits? Wait, really?
Yep. Especially for marriage-based petitions.
Wow, so like immigration officers showing up at your doorstep to make sure your marriage is the real deal.
That's exactly what we're talking about. It would definitely add a certain level of pressure to the whole process, to say the least.
You think? I can imagine that would be incredibly stressful for couples.
Oh, absolutely. Even those in the, genuine loving relationships.
Right, of course. But I guess from the government's perspective, it's all about weeding out the fraudulent applications.
That's the idea. They want to make sure that the relationships are legit and that people aren't, trying to game the system.
I can see that. But it does make you wonder about, the potential for overreach.
Definitely. It's a delicate balance,
Yeah.
for sure. All right, let's move on to the second area of potential change highlighted in the video, the reimplementation of the 2019 public charge rule.
The public charge rule. Oh, yeah, that was a big one.
It was. And for those who might not remember it, can you give us a quick refresher on what that is?
Sure. So basically, the public charge rule makes it harder for folks who have used certain public assistance programs, think things like Medicaid or SNFP, food stamps, to get their family petitions approved.
So if someone has relied on those programs in the past, even if they're doing well financially, now it could still count against them.
Exactly. It's all about trying to predict whether someone might become dependent on government assistance in the future.
So they're looking at past behavior as an indicator of future need.
Right. Which you can see how that would be controversial.
Oh, absolutely.
Well,
It definitely raises questions about fairness. Like, what about folks who might have needed temporary help, during a rough patch?
right. Should that automatically disqualify them from sponsoring a loved one years down the line?
Tough question. And it was a very controversial policy during Trump's first term.
For sure. And it's definitely something that would likely be challenged again if it were to be re-implemented.
Okay. So public charge rule, that's number 2. What's next on our list?
Let's see. Number 3, the video anticipates a greater emphasis on fraud prevention across the board.
Fraud prevention. So basically they're going to be cracking down even harder on anyone they suspect of trying to, cheat the system.
Right. And that means even stricter documentation requirements for I-130 petitions.
Stricter than they already are. Wow.
Yep. which likely means more requests for evidence from USCIS and potentially more denials for insufficient documentation.
So the message here is dot your I's, cross your T's,
Right.
and make sure you have everything they ask for.
Absolutely. And remember, we're not just talking about basic paperwork here. We're talking about providing substantial evidence to prove the legitimacy of the relationship.
Especially for marriage-based petitions, right?
Especially for marriage-based petitions. You need to show proof of cohabitation, joint financial records, a history of shared experiences, basically anything that demonstrates a genuine and ongoing partnership.
Wow, that sounds like a lot of work.
It is, and it can be very overwhelming for some applicants.
I bet. So if you're thinking about filing an I-130 petition in the future, be prepared to gather a lot of documentation.
And organize it meticulously.
Right. Having a well-organized and comprehensive application package is going to be absolutely crucial if these changes go into effect.
Agreed. Okay, so we've covered increased scrutiny, national security concerns, the public charge rule, and stricter documentation requirements. What's number 4?
Number 4 is a crackdown on fraudulent claims, particularly in, you guessed it, marriage-based petitions.
Yes. Marriage-based petitions, always a target.
It seems that way.
Yeah.
So what does this crackdown look like in practice?
Well, the analysis suggests we could see a significant uptick in those home visits we mentioned earlier.
Oh, right, the immigration officer showing up at your door.
Exactly, as well as more intensive relationship scrutiny during interviews.
So basically, they're going to be looking for any little thing that might suggest the marriage isn't legit.
Right. And the consequences for those caught engaging in fraudulent activities could be pretty severe.
Like, how severe are we talking here?
We're talking deportation for the beneficiary, the person being sponsored for immigration, and potentially even a permanent ban from entering the U.S. for both the sponsor and the beneficiary.
Wow, that's a huge risk.
It is. It's a very clear message that immigration fraud will not be tolerated.
So yeah, honesty and transparency are absolutely paramount in this process.
No doubt about it. All right, so that's 4 down, 1 to go. What's the last area of potential change?
The last one, and this one's a biggie, is processing times.
Processing times. The bane of every immigrant's existence.
I know, right? And unfortunately, the video anticipates that processing times for I-130 petitions could become even longer under a potential second Trump administration.
Longer? Seriously, how is that even possible?
Well, it seems there are a few factors at play. The increased scrutiny and documentation requirements we've already discussed, those are definitely going to add time to the review process.
Right, more paperwork, more time spent reviewing it.
Exactly. Plus, the analysis suggests that resources might be shifted towards border enforcement, which could mean fewer personnel available to handle family-based petitions.
So basically they're prioritizing border security over family reunification.
That seems to be the trend. And then on top of all that, there's the overall tightening of procedures. More checks and balances, more layers of review, all of which contribute to a slower pace.
So the takeaway here is, if you're planning to sponsor a family member, be prepared for a long wait.
And I mean a long wait.
Yeah.
We're talking potentially years.
Years. Oh, man, that's rough.
It is. But that's the reality we might be facing if these changes come to pass. So yeah, buckle up, folks. Patience is going to be key.
And as we've been saying throughout this deep dive, make sure you have all your ducks in a row.
Absolutely. Having a strong application package and an experienced immigration attorney on your side is going to be more important than ever.
Couldn't agree more. Welcome back, everyone.
All right, so let's dive back into these potential immigration policy changes and try to really get a handle on what they might mean for people on the ground.
Yeah, let's make it real.
Exactly. So let's say you're a U.S. citizen and you want to sponsor your spouse for a green card. The classic scenario.
Mm-hmm.
How would these stricter rules we've been talking about, how would they affect your application?
Well, first of all, under this whole heightened national security scrutiny thing, both you and your spouse would be facing much more extensive background checks.
Okay, so more digging into your past.
Oh, yeah. These checks would be going deep, looking for any criminal history, even minor offenses stuff you might not even think about anymore.
So, like what? Give me an example.
Like, let's say you got a DUI back in college, or, some minor offense that was eventually expunged.
Stuff happens.
Exactly. But that doesn't mean it disappears completely. Would that kind of thing automatically disqualify someone?
That's a good question.
It's tough to say for sure, not necessarily, but it would definitely trigger further investigation and could potentially delay the process by a lot.
So basically, don't try to hide anything.
Exactly. Transparency is key here. You want to be upfront about everything and demonstrate that you're a person of good moral character, someone who doesn't pose a threat.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
So background checks, got it.
Okay.
What about the public charge rule? We talked about that earlier. How would that come into play for our hypothetical couple?
Right, so remember how we said that if your spouse has ever used public benefits, even for a short time, it could raise a red flag?
Yeah, that seems kind of harsh.
Well, it's definitely something to be aware of, because even if your spouse is financially stable now, that past reliance on those programs could still hurt their chances.
So they're really looking at the long game here.
They are. The idea is to assess the likelihood of someone becoming dependent on government assistance at any point in the future.
I see. So past usage is seen as a potential indicator of future need.
Right. And you can understand why some people would find that unfair.
Oh, totally.
Uh.
Especially if someone just needed a little help, to get through a tough time.
Right, exactly. It's a complicated issue with valid arguments on both sides.
For sure. Okay, so we've got the background checks, the public charge rule. What about the documentation requirements? You mentioned those could get even stricter. What would that look like for our couple?
Okay, so picture this. You have to prove every single aspect of your relationship with meticulous documentation.
Everything.
Pretty much. I'm talking photos, travel itineraries, joint bank statements, lease agreements showing you live together, even affidavits from friends and family. Basically sworn statements testifying to the legitimacy of your marriage.
Wow, that's intense. It's like building a legal case.
In a way, it is. And the burden of proof is on you. Any missing pieces or inconsistencies could lead to requests for more evidence, which means delays or even a denial.
So basically, you can't be too careful.
Exactly. You need to be organized, thorough, and prepared for anything.
Got it. Okay, so let's say our couple has jumped through all the hoops. They've got their documentation. They've passed their interviews with flying colors. But then what happens if there's still some suspicion of fraud? Like maybe the immigration officer just gets a weird vibe.
Oh, that's a tricky situation. Because under this potential crackdown on fraudulent claims, even a hint of suspicion could trigger a full-blown investigation.
Full-blown investigation, like what does that entail?
We're talking more home visits, in-depth questioning, maybe even surveillance in some cases.
Surveillance? Are you serious?
Yep. It might sound extreme, but it shows you how serious they are about weeding out fraudulent applications.
Okay, so the stakes are high.
Very high, which is why it's so important to be honest and transparent throughout the entire process.
No cutting corners.
None whatsoever. Okay, so I've talked about the potential for increased scrutiny, tougher documentation requirements, and even investigations. What about the overall timeline? How long could all of this take?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And unfortunately, the answer is probably longer than you'd like.
Ugh, the waiting game is the worst.
I know. And as we mentioned earlier, the video predicts that processing times for I-130 petitions could get significantly longer if these changes are implemented.
So we're talking months, years.
Potentially years, yeah. And that's on top of all the time and energy you've already invested in preparing your application.
So it's basically a marathon, not a sprint.
Exactly. And you need to be prepared for the long haul, both emotionally and logistically.
All right, so let's recap. If you're thinking about sponsoring a family member under these potential new rules, what's the key takeaway?
I think the most important thing is to be prepared. Be over-prepared.
Right. Dot your I's, cross your T's, and then dot them again.
Exactly. Gather every single piece of evidence you can to prove the legitimacy of your relationship.
And don't go it alone.
Right. Talk to an experienced immigration attorney who can guide you through the process and advocate for you.
Because navigating this system is only going to get more complicated.
Okay, so that's for people who are just starting to think about sponsoring a family member. What about folks who are already in the middle of the process? Like, what if you've already filed an I-130 petition, but it hasn't been approved yet?
That's a great question. And unfortunately, there's no easy answer. It would really depend on the timing of the policy changes and how USCIS decides to implement them.
So more uncertainty.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
Which just underscores the importance of staying informed and seeking legal guidance.
Okay, so far we've been focusing on how these changes might affect individual applicants. But let's zoom out a bit and think about the bigger picture. What kind of ripple effects could we see on a larger scale if these policies are actually implemented?
That's a really important question to consider because immigration policy doesn't exist in a vacuum. It affects families, communities, the economy, even our country's standing in the world.
Wow, so big implications.
Huge. And one of the most immediate areas where we'd likely see an impact is family unity.
Right. We've talked about the potential for prolonged separations, but how would that actually play out in real life?
Well, imagine families being forced to live apart for years while they navigate this more complex and potentially more restrictive system.
It's hard to even fathom that.
It is. And the emotional toll on both the individuals and the family as a whole would be immense. We're talking about parents being separated from their children, spouses living in different countries for years. It's heartbreaking.
Absolutely. And it's not just about the emotional side of things either.
But right, the economic impact could be significant too. Imagine a family where the primary breadwinner is unable to immigrate because of these stricter requirements. That could put a huge financial burden on the family and potentially lead to real hardship.
So it's not just about navigating bureaucratic hurdles.
Not at all. We're talking about real people facing real-life challenges as a direct result of these policy decisions.
Okay, so families would definitely be affected. But what about the U.S. economy as a whole? How would these changes impact that?
Well, we know that immigrants play a vital role in our workforce, right? They fill jobs across all sorts of industries and contribute significantly to our economic growth.
That's true. So if it becomes harder for skilled workers to immigrate, especially through family sponsorship, wouldn't that have a negative impact?
It definitely could. We could see labor shortages in certain sectors, which could ultimately hinder economic growth and innovation.
So it's a bit of a double-edged sword.
It is. Proponents of stricter immigration controls argue that these measures are necessary to protect American jobs and prevent wages from being driven down. But critics argue that restricting immigration could actually harm the economy in the long run.
It's a complex issue for sure.
Very complex, and it highlights the need for nuanced and informed discussions about immigration policy. We need to move beyond the sound bites and slogans and really grapple with the complexities.
Absolutely. Okay, so we've talked about the potential economic impact. What about the social and cultural implications?
That's another crucial aspect to consider. You know, the U.S. has always prided itself on being a nation of immigrants, a melting pot of cultures, a place where people from all over the world can come to build a better life.
The American dream.
Exactly. But if these changes make the immigration process seem much more daunting and restrictive, it could really damage America's image abroad.
So other countries might start to see us as less welcoming.
Potentially, yeah. It could send the message that America is closing its doors, that we're no longer the land of opportunity.
And that could have repercussions beyond just immigration.
Absolutely. It could affect diplomacy, international relations, even tourism. And it could make it harder for us to attract talent from around the world.
Interesting. So immigration policy is about a lot more than just, who gets to come here and who doesn't.
It is. It's about shaping perceptions, projecting values, and influencing how the U.S. is viewed on a global stage.
Okay, I'm starting to see the bigger picture here. So we've talked about the economic impact, the global implications. What about the impact on immigrant communities within the U.S.?
That's another critical piece of the puzzle. Stricter enforcement and the fear of deportation could create a climate of anxiety and mistrust within immigrant communities.
That makes sense. It would be hard to feel safe and secure if you're constantly worried about being targeted.
Exactly. Even if you're here legally, that constant fear can be incredibly debilitating.
Absolutely. And it could also discourage people from engaging with their communities.
Oh, absolutely. People might be less likely to report crimes to the police or seek health care or participate in community events if they're afraid of drawing attention to themselves.
So these policies could actually make communities less safe, not more.
That's a real concern.
Yeah.
And it highlights the unintended consequences that can arise when policies are driven by fear and mistrust.
So it's a delicate balance.
It is. We need to find a way to enforce the law and protect our borders while also upholding the values of fairness and inclusion that have always defined America.
Well said. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here, and it's been pretty heavy stuff. To be honest, it's a little bit discouraging to think about all the potential negative impacts of these policy changes.
I hear you. It can be overwhelming, but I think it's important to remember that we're not powerless. We can make a difference.
Okay, so we've talked about how these potential immigration policy changes, the stricter requirements, the longer processing times, the whole 9 yards. We've talked about how all that could affect individuals and families who are trying to, navigate the system. But let's zoom out a little bit now.
Yeah, let's look at the bigger picture.
Exactly. Because immigration policy, it doesn't exist in a vacuum.
Right, not at all. It has ripple effects that extend way beyond the individuals who are directly involved in the application process.
So let's talk about those ripple effects.
Yeah.
What kind of broader impact could we see if these potential changes actually become a reality?
Well, one area that immediately comes to mind is the impact on families.
Right, we've talked about the potential for, prolonged separations due to the stricter requirements and the longer processing times.
Exactly. But let's really delve into that a little bit deeper. Imagine families being forced to live apart for years on end while they're trying to navigate this complex and potentially much more restrictive system.
It's hard to even imagine that kind of separation.
It is, and the emotional toll on everyone involved would be enormous. We're talking about parents being separated from their children, spouses living in different countries for years on end, just this constant uncertainty and anxiety.
It would be incredibly difficult.
Absolutely. And it's not just about the emotional well-being either, although that's obviously a huge factor.
Right, there are practical considerations too.
Exactly. Think about the economic consequences. Imagine a family where the primary breadwinner is unable to immigrate because of these stricter requirements. That could put a massive financial strain on the family, potentially even leading to real hardship.
So it's not just a matter of, jumping through a few bureaucratic hoops.
It's not. It's about real people facing real-life challenges as a direct result of these policy decisions.
Okay, so families would definitely bear the brunt of these changes. But what about the bigger picture? How would these potential policy changes affect the U.S. economy as a whole?
Well, we know that immigrants play a really vital role in our workforce, right? They fill jobs across all sorts of industries. They contribute to economic growth and innovation.
That's true. So if it becomes significantly more difficult for skilled workers to immigrate, particularly through family-based sponsorship, wouldn't that have a negative impact on the economy?
It very well could. We might start to see labor shortages in certain sectors, which could ultimately hinder economic growth and, stifle innovation.
So it's a bit of a balancing act.
It is. Proponents of stricter immigration controls, they argue that these measures are necessary to protect American jobs and prevent wages from being driven down. But critics, they argue that restricting immigration could actually harm the economy in the long run.
It's a complex issue, for sure.
It is, and it really highlights the need for more nuanced and informed discussions about immigration policy. We need to move beyond the sound bites and slogans and really grapple with the complexities.
I agree. Okay, so we've talked about the potential impact on families, the potential economic impact. What about the social and cultural implications?
That's another really important area to consider. The U.S. has always prided itself on being a nation of immigrants, a melting pot of cultures, a beacon of hope for people from all over the world.
The American dream.
Exactly. But if these changes go through and the immigration process becomes much more daunting and restrictive, it could really damage America's image abroad.
So other countries might start to see us as less welcoming.
Potentially, yeah. It sends the message that America is closing its doors, that we're no longer the land of opportunity that we used to be.
And that could have repercussions beyond just immigration.
Oh, absolutely. It could affect diplomacy, international relations, even tourism. It could make it harder for us to attract talent from around the world.
Wow, so the stakes are pretty high.
They are immigration policy. It's about so much more than just who gets to come here and who doesn't. It's about shaping perceptions. It's about projecting our values. It's about influencing how the U.S. is viewed on the global stage.
Okay, so we've talked about the economic impact, the global implications. What about the impact on immigrant communities here within the U.S.?
That's another critical piece of the puzzle. Stricter enforcement and the fear of deportation, it could create a real climate of anxiety and mistrust within immigrant communities.
That makes sense. People would be constantly worried about being targeted even if they're here illegally.
Exactly. That kind of fear, it can be incredibly debilitating. It can prevent people from living their lives to the fullest.
Absolutely. And it could also discourage people from, engaging with their communities.
Oh, absolutely. People might be less likely to report crimes to the police or seek health care or participate in community events if they're afraid of drawing attention to themselves.
So these policies could actually make communities less safe.
That's a real concern. And it highlights the unintended consequences that can arise when policies are driven by fear and mistrust.
So it seems like there's a real need for balance here.
There is. We need to find a way to enforce the law and protect our borders while also upholding the values of fairness and inclusion that have always been so important to America.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground today. And to be honest, it's a little bit overwhelming to think about all the potential consequences of these policy changes.
I understand. It can be a lot to take in, but I think it's important to remember that we're not powerless. We can make a difference.
So what can our listeners do? What steps can they take to, stay informed and maybe even get involved in advocating for more just and humane immigration policies?
Well, first and foremost, I think it's crucial to stay informed. Stay up to date on the latest developments in immigration policy, both at the national level and at the local level.
So do your research, read reputable news sources, follow organizations that are working on these issues?
Exactly. And once you have a good understanding of the issues, don't be afraid to speak up.
So contact your elected officials, attend rallies, write letters to the editor.
All of that. And support organizations that are working to protect the rights of immigrants and advocate for more just and humane policies.
Those are all great suggestions. And I think it's important to remember that even small actions can make a difference.
They absolutely can. Every voice matters. Every act of support can help to create a more welcoming and inclusive society.
Well said. Okay, so that's our deep dive into potential U.S. immigration policy changes under a hypothetical second Trump administration.
We've covered a lot of ground today.
We have. We've talked about the specific policy changes that have been proposed, the potential impact on individuals and families, the broader implications for the economy and for society as a whole. And we've discussed ways that our listeners can get involved and make their voices heard.
It's a complex issue with no easy answers.
But it's an issue that affects all of us.
And it's an issue that deserves our attention, our thoughtful consideration, and our active engagement.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So thank you for joining us for this deep dive. We hope you found it informative and thought-provoking.
And we hope it inspires you to learn more, to get involved, and to make a difference.
Thanks for listening, everyone.